Um, okay, everyone. I'm so happy to see you here today. I know it's a sunny Friday afternoon. So thank you a lot for being here. Thanks to Bergen Global for hosting us and to the Center for Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at the University of Bergen. And of course, a very big thank you to Professor Sune Haugbølle, who is joining us here today and will be sharing his latest research with us and his book project. So Sune's talk today is entitled The History of Palestine Solidarity in Scandinavia. In this talk, Sune will ask, what is Palestine solidarity and how did it emerge and develop globally and in Scandinavia? So he'll share his research on the connections and ideas that transformed a regional struggle into a global cause from the late 1960s onwards. What was the role of Scandinavia in this history? And how did Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian activists contribute to the development of a transnational, visual, and ideological vocabulary that lives on in the current protests against the war in Gaza? And I think Sune's research is extremely relevant for thinking about the present moment that we are in today. You know, Palestinians in Gaza and on the West Bank are facing unprecedented violence, genocide, starvation, and the complete destruction of education and healthcare. This week, mass graves have been discovered daily in Gaza. At the same time, attacks on and the criminalization of Palestine solidarity and free speech really are also unprecedented. Not so much here in Norway, perhaps, but in many other parts of the world. I'm sure many of you have seen what's happening on college campuses across the US at the moment. So I think Sune's research is a very welcome reminder that people have always cared and have always stood up for justice. And while as a historian, I'm not sure that history can actually teach us anything. You know, history is not a person that can offer up lessons, but we can choose to do something with this history. And I think that's what we'll try to do today. So Sune Haugbølle is professor at Roskilde University in Denmark. His expertise is global political sociology with a focus on the Middle East. He's made very significant contributions to the fields of social memory studies, the history of radical movements, and transnational solidarity. His many articles and books are widely cited in the literature on Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria, and on the growing field of the Arab left. And many of his books and articles touch on central themes in political sociology, such as mass media, revolution, ideology, incarceration, transitional justice, the state, mobilization, and intellectual history and urban sociology. And we will have plenty of time for questions after Sune's talk. I'd like to mention that this lecture or this talk is being recorded. So if you would like to not be recorded when you ask your question, please let us know. Also, if you're joining on Zoom, you can type your questions in the chat. And with that, I'd like to welcome Sune Haugbølle.
Yeah. Thank you, Pelle. Thank you for that generous introduction. And hello, everyone, also online. It's a pleasure to be here in Bergen and talk about this timely topic. Like Pelle said, the context is clear to us all. We have the demonstrations in Columbia University and across campuses in the US. We have a real global occupation with Palestine and the Palestinian question. And we have the terrible war in Gaza. And all of this has come, if you want, as a bit sudden to me, because I've been working on this topic of Palestine solidarity for the last 5 years. So it's quite amazing in a way to be finishing this research now in this atmosphere and to be thinking about what this history, like Pelle said, can teach us. So what a time in a way to be talking about this topic. So the question that's been driving me for the last 5-6 years is why and how did Palestine become a global cause? For the left in particular, but also for others. And that's one of the things I've discovered, that Palestine was and is also important for Christian groups, for liberals, and for many others than just what we think of as the left. So which forces were it that allowed Palestine to assume the position of a global cause alongside other anti-imperial, decolonial, and national liberation struggles like Vietnam and South Africa? My research focuses very much on the life stories of the people involved as activists in Scandinavia. But I've been working with others in my research project who look at the UK and Cuba and other countries and Germany. So I'm trying to have a global picture, but I've dug deep into my own backyard, Scandinavia. And it's been quite a learning experience. I've been going to Norway and Sweden, and of course, in Denmark. So this focus and this choice was partly actually a result of the COVID situation, that I was forced to really start using my own archives because I couldn't go anywhere for a while. But what a luck in a way, because I've really discovered fantastic histories. So these stories, the individual stories, lead us back to the world of the 1960s. And by choosing to take these individual stories, I want to shift the focus from diplomatic history to grassroots history, to the friendships, the connections, but also the institutions that facilitated the globalization of the Palestinian cause. And that's the short version of what I'm trying to do. The longer version is a lot more complicated, but also I think more colorful and interesting. And it connects us to the question of Palestine in our Nordic countries. So I want to give a glimpse to you today into the world of solidarity movements, how they started, how they linked up to the Palestinian liberation movement, and how they developed from the late 60s to the early 70s. And like Pelle said, I'm working on a book about this, and I follow them beyond 1973. So not just in the very active years in the beginning, but I'll be mostly speaking about that early period until 73 today. There's so much ground to cover, and the story is complicated. And even after 1982, it continues in very interesting ways and connects to today. But I don't necessarily intend to cover the whole ground in my book. I think one has to do it carefully when we do this kind of social history. So you can also spread yourself too thin if you look at too much. So let's begin with the beginning. And the beginning of Palestine solidarity. That's going to be the first chapter. So I divided the talk into chapters, a bit like chapters in a story or chapters in a book. So let's start with a world full of hope and optimism, and look at the roots of Palestine solidarity. Kan ya makan, like they say in Arabic. Once upon a time, there was a world full of hope and optimism. This is how we often think of the 1960s. And I think there is a very interesting relation, actually, between the 1967 war. In Arab historiography, 67 has a particular meaning, which is in many ways a negative meaning, because it was the defeat, but it was also a regenerative defeat. A lot of things happened because of the defeat, in particular, a sort of radicalization, the birth of Islamism, and so on, we think of as a result of 67. But it was also the year that saw new Palestinian revolutionary movements. And so there is this interesting relation between that year in Arab historiography and 1968 in Western or global historiography, the year of the student rebellion, the Sorbonne moment, if you want. So we go back to that year many times when or those who have studied the birth of the Palestine issue. And I think that makes some sense. But what I found in my research is that the Palestine cause did not begin in 67. It certainly began in many ways with the struggle for Palestinian independence and authority and autonomy, meaning back in the 20s and 30s. But the transformation of this struggle into a cause was a slow process. And of course, in many ways, it materialized into something much more concrete after 67. But just to go back to 48, which of course is a super important year here. If you look at the war in 48 and the creation of Israel, that created a resonance in the Arab countries in particular. The Palestine resonated deeply in Arab publics, and it became a cause, a rallying cry, and a struggle for political actors in the decolonizing era. Arab nationalist, socialist, and communist groups that we think of and start to talk about from the 50s as the Arab left viewed the loss of Palestine as the result of Zionist and Western colonialism in the region, and recapturing Palestine required the mobilization of the Arab peoples. For Nasserists, recapturing Palestine would energize the unification of the Arabs. Consequently, Palestinian militants should remain under Arab nationalist control, as they were when the Arab League founded the PLO in 1964. So that was still sort of the framework of thinking about the Palestinian struggle up until the mid-60s. When you look at another side of the Arab left, the Arab communist parties, they took a more cautious approach to Palestine. They supported the idea of Palestinian independence, but they also went through the Soviet lens, if you want, and the Soviet Union supported the 1948 UN partition plan and remained somewhat cautious, as did the Arab communist parties who followed suit with the Comintern. So between the communists and the Arab nationalist line, a third position emerged, mostly represented by young Marxist-Leninists. They saw Palestine as more than a pawn in a big power rivalry or a step towards Arab unification, which is the communist Nasserist line. They were critical of Moscow, but they were also critical of the Arab regimes. And they began to think of themselves as a new left. And they saw Palestine as the condensation of national and class contradictions that were plaguing the Middle East. Resolving Palestine could therefore serve to start a broader revolution, because it was linked to some of the fundamental problems of the political order. So the story of this Arab New Left is quite interesting and complicated, and I've written a bit about that. And I have to say, I mean, even though they were critical of Nasserism, they were also somewhat allied to Nasser up until 1967. And then, of course, Nasser loses the war, and then we're into a new territory. I'll be showing a lot of pictures from the propaganda, if you want, from the posters, the rich material that the PLO produced, that the PFLP and Fatah produced, and I'll be talking a bit about it. So that's sort of the backdrop. I'm not necessarily going to be explaining all of these pictures, but you can enjoy them while you listen to me. So after June 67 and the defeat, many Palestinians turned fully against the idea of Arab leadership and instead embraced the idea of a popular struggle that was organized locally and embraced globally. So this shift towards a people's war, if you want, coincided with many leftists beginning to favor organic organization from below, which had proven successful in Vietnam, in Cuba, and in Algeria. Palestinians had participated in the Tricontinental Meeting in Cuba in 1966, and Palestine was becoming a key cause in these kind of tricontinental networks. The argument for a people's war was already gradually put forth from the late 1950s onwards by critical Marxist thinkers breaking with the established Arab communist parties in publications like El Horiya, a journal out of Beirut, which was linked to the Arab nationalist movement, which was formally pro-Nasser, but also contained the seeds of dissent within the pro-Nasser left, if you want, that after 67 would materialize into the formation of the DFLP and the PFLP, so the Palestinian left that we know even today. So it was also in El Horiya, which has been a great source for me as I've been doing this research project, that we can read from the early 60s the first novels and essays of Ghassan Kanafani, the Palestinian writer, becomes very important for my story. He made his name then and became integral for the organization of Palestinians in Beirut. And I'll tell you more about him soon. What interests me about the Arab New Left is that their political and intellectual labor before 67 was not on the global radar in any major way. And then, after 67, it became transported to a global leftist public at a lightning speed. And people in Bergen and Oslo and Copenhagen would be reading these ideas. And this happened in a couple of years' time. A very quick translation at a global scale, which I think can be explained by resonance. So what do I mean by resonance? I think this is where we can turn to Scandinavia and think of some of these moments like the Battle of Karami and how they began at that time to be followed and to be important for how leftists thought about the world. The cause of anti-imperialism and the solidarities that emerged around anti-imperialism resonated. British and French power was ceding in the Middle East, and Arab intellectuals began to associate imperialism with global American hegemony. Meanwhile, American power in Europe also came under scrutiny by student movements and parts of the left, exemplified in Denmark and Norway by Socialistisk Folkeparti, which you may know was founded in Denmark in 59 and in Norway in 61, and not strictly as an anti-imperialist party, but as a step out of the traditional left and sort of a finding of this middle ground that becomes a new left also in the Nordic countries. So this shift crystallized during the early 1960s when the African-American struggle, the Vietnam War, and so on began to feature in international leftist circles. We can see it, for example, again in Al Hurriya, and at the same time in Scandinavia, in publications like Politisk Revue in Copenhagen, which is a new left journal that begins to be published. And here you see some of the publications that people in Scandinavia would not read at this time, but actually some of the same ideas would be present on the left. I think there are also a lot of differences between these publications, but also some similarities. I'll talk more about Politisk Revue a little bit later. But just to stick a little bit with the New Arab Left, because it's really important for understanding the foundation of the ideas that become central for Palestine solidarity. So in order to separate the liberation battle for the Arab New Left from the agenda of Arab regimes, they had to make a break at the ideological level, but also the institutional level. And this break occurred when Fedayeen transformed into organized military units, into organized political units as well. And that got the world's attention. And of course, this happened in the years between 63 and 68. And with the 67 war and the defeat, the Fedayeen groups were integrated into the PLO and took over control of the PLO in 1968, in 69. And then Palestine was really transformed from a regional cause directed by the Arab states to an international cause supported widely by the global left. So this happens just in those 2 years. Quite amazing. The Battle of Karame that I showed a poster from here was a key turning point. After that, the aim was, as the Fatah intellectual Elias Sanbar put it, to reverse Nasser's plan of uniting the Arabs in order to secure the return of Palestine, and instead secure the return of Palestine in order to unite the Arabs. So he put Palestine first instead of putting the Arab cause first. And the Palestinians would be front troops and leaders of this revolution. It would be a revolution of society for some of them as well, a revolution of the way you think about your place in the world and the global South's place in the world. And for some, it was a wider revolution also against the whole economic system and the political system. And that really rang a bell with the leftists who were running around in other parts of the world too. And I think this is exactly where we're getting close to why Palestine was discovered as a global cause. So I'll turn to that now in the next chapter here, the discovery of Palestine around 67. So the birth of Palestine solidarity took different paths in different national contexts. Arab students in Paris already in the early 60s led conversations about Zionism, and there are lots of other examples of solidarity and awareness outside of the Arab countries before 67. This work prepared the ground for the emergence of Palestine as a left-wing cause when the PLO appeared on the scene as the obvious liaison and object of solidarity from 1964. Scandinavia is similar to many other European countries in the sense that the left had been generally pro-Israeli, which was a legacy of anti-fascism during the Second World War. Many of them had gone to Israel in kibbutzim and saw Israel as a socialist experiment, as a fight against fascist countries and ideologies surrounding them in the Middle East. But the new anti-imperialism put a question mark on that whole understanding, a bit like the emergence of decolonization as a general framework for student activism since 2020. I mean, this might be controversial, but we can discuss that. I think that has given a platform, an ideological platform and framework for Palestine solidarity today. Having said that, there are also many differences between 1967 and 2023. Not least the amount of general knowledge that we have about Palestine today. I think learning about Palestine back then was much more of a struggle. And a lot of the work that they were actually doing in these networks was informing themselves first, just getting books and getting information through their contacts from Palestine and from Arab countries. Then doing sort of reading groups, mini Middle East studies seminars, because there was no Middle East studies at the university. Maybe Knut has a different view on that and can remember. But from some of the Norwegians, they didn't know where to go at the university, so they had to do it themselves. And then after that, they started teaching others and creating these reading circles. And then they started teaching society, right? And I'll show you how. Before 1967, Swedes, Norwegians, and Danes did not think of Palestine as something separate from Israel. That was the whole thing. Even learning that there was such a thing as Palestine and Palestinians was a radical new idea. Books and novels on Palestine mainly dealt with the Jewish return to Israel. In the immediate post-war period, the left in all Western European countries were overwhelmingly pro-Israeli, as I said, and associated its struggle for survival with the anti-fascist struggle. Contesting this frame was hard work. The left continued to view Palestinians for the main as an irritation to accepted beliefs surrounding Zionism's function as a progressive national liberation movement for the Jewish people in Palestine. Or they saw them just as Arabs. This was a very a normal way to talk about the natives in that country. They were Arabs. Of course, being Arabs, they might as well live in other Arab countries. Add to that the kibbutz experience, like I talked about. Many young Scandinavians wanted to see for themselves what the future of this bright new socialism was, and they went and were volunteers. Two such people were the pioneers of the Norwegian Palestine Committee, the Palestina-Komiteen, Finn Schue and Peder Martin Lysestøl. And I think Peder Martin might be listening online today, and makes me a little bit nervous when I'm talking about him in a due course. But I just want to show you a couple of things first here before we start on these stories. So this is a picture of the Palestinian diaspora, and I think it's an artwork, right? But it gives you a nice idea of how many places in the world Palestinians actually went after 48, meaning that there were diasporas on which to build solidarity networks. And these diasporas are very important. I mean, the story of Palestine solidarity is not just a native French, German, Scandinavian story. It's also a story of connecting to Palestinians living here. Here's a good picture of some of these young dudes in Oslo. These two men, Finn Schue and Peder Martin Lysestøl, independently of each other, spent time in Israel in the mid-1960s. An early member of the Norwegian New Left Socialist Party, the SF, formed in 1963, Lysestøl went to Israel in 1964 to study kibbutz socialism, but ended up befriending Palestinian peasants near the kibbutz where he was staying. And this was a real sort of formative experience that triggered an interest in Arab politics, which he later pursued in Belgrade and in Cairo. And during his time in Cairo in the late 60s, Lysestøl also visited Gaza and made friends with some of the members of Fatah. And he fell in love with and eventually married an Egyptian student activist. Finn Schue traveled to Israel first in 1965 and again shortly after the 1967 war. He was a young law student from a conservative background, but still supported Israel and still supported Israel at this point. But he had a chance visit to the Golan Heights with a group of American tourists while he was living in the kibbutz in North Israel. And he was suddenly stuck up there with this obnoxious group of American tourists. And the way they talked made him realize that he was backing the wrong team. As the tourists were cheering at the sight of a destroyed Syrian tank, Schue remembers thinking, this is from his own memoirs of this, he says, "This blonde Norwegian began to feel unwell. What the hell am I doing here?" A shrill reply came shortly after from one of the American tourists. "Oh, look, this is exactly what our boys are doing in Vietnam," she said. Her cry was like a horse kick in the gut. What the US was doing in Vietnam was easy to understand, but now I realized that Israel was engaged in the same brutal kind of warfare, targeted raw occupation. Why had I not been able to see that before? So many of them describe this moment when suddenly what should have been completely clear becomes clear as day. And there's a lot of personal stories like that, actually, from many European countries that paint a similar picture of a conversion, some of them having a sudden epiphany at some point, but some of them a sort of gradual conversion. And it happens around 67, late 60s for all of them. The Danish historian Marxist Morten Ting, who's still very active and lives just around the corner from me in Copenhagen, and I have coffee with him often and hear these stories. He, in the late 60s, became an important pro-Palestinian voice. He describes a similar story of political reorientation in his memoir. After he returned to Denmark from a kibbutz stay, the increasingly radical Vietnam anti-war demonstrations and the June 67 war, and his work for the leftist journal Politisk Revue, led him to adopt a radically different view of Palestine. He is a Dane with a Jewish background. And of course, he had supported Israel. And he remembers the moment when he began to feel ashamed about his stance towards the Jewish state, which he now had come to view as the last European colony in a long history of violent oppression and mass murder in Latin America, Africa, and Australia. This equivalation of Israel with colonialism and racism and Palestine with third world liberation struggle amounted to a reorientation in political youth groups and also on the editorial board of Politisk Revue. Here's Politisk Revue. While all of this was going on in the north, the Palestinian organizations, and particularly the PLO, enhanced and curated their global offensive that several people have studied in the last couple of years. They set up foreign relations and arts and cinema units. They circulated English language material and other publications and became very active in seeking contact with solidarity groups around the world. From 1965, the PLO Research Center was set up in Beirut, and they had a concerted publication strategy from its office under the directorship of Fayez Sayek and later his brother Anis. Fayez Sayek was a very interesting figure. He was a diplomat, a Palestinian diplomat, and a scholar who, after 48, had spent time and made a career at American and European universities like Yale, Stanford, and Oxford. And then he moved to Beirut and became fully engaged in the cause. He led a team of some 40 writers, academics, and translators who published book series and pamphlets. And you see some of them here on the table. And I've collected them actually from the archives of activists in Scandinavia, which shows that these publications, not only did they make it to Scandinavia and were distributed, but actually some of them were published in Scandinavian language as well. I found the book on Zionist colonialism in Palestine, translated into Swedish and sold in Beirut for 1 lira in the local currency. So they clearly expected there would be a market of Swedish readers in Beirut for this, which I find kind of amazing. Some of these books highlighted the anti-imperialist nature of the struggle. And many of the books that they published focus on reinterpreting the role of Israel as a settler colonial state. Sayek himself authored several of the volumes and may actually have been the first to present a detailed articulation of the idea of settler colonialism, something that a lot of people actually attribute to Maxime Rodinson, but Rodinson got it from Fayez Sayek. I think that's very important, actually, to attribute that theorization that's so important and current today to the people whose struggle it came out of. Between 65 and 70, a large corpus of these texts began to circulate in leftist circles globally. And we can create a kind of inventory of them by going through the publication registers of the PLO, PFLP, and Fatah. But tracing their impact is a different story. And there, of course, I've had to do interviews and talk to people about how they remember reading them. This is the sort of thing I'm interested in my research. Not the fact that there was these texts or these posters, but what they meant. What was the interpretation of it? And I can also here turn to some of the solidarity journals as archival entries in the broader historical question of the globalization of the Palestine cause. As already mentioned, some of the general leftist journals like Politisk Revue wrote about Palestine early on, even in the mid-60s, and translated the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish, for example. But actual Palestine journals only emerged with the formation of Palestine groups in Sweden and the committees in Norway and Denmark. The Palestine groups in Sweden were formed in '69, and the Palestine committees in Denmark and Norway were formed in the autumn of 1970. So protest movements against the Vietnam War had politicized many on the left who had previously not been overtly against American influence, but really became that through the Vietnam protests. As early as '63, they were learning how to protest. They were getting a register of protest, if you want, through that work. And those were really big movements. I mean, the people's movement against Vietnam really drew in a lot of writers and artists and so on, I think, in all the Scandinavian countries. So they channeled that energy into setting up groups that were committed and devoted to Palestine. They also set up other groups. There were working groups on Cuba and South Africa and Chile and so on. It was a broader phenomenon, but it was a kind of a specialization where you could say that Palestine got special attention, and that became clear. It was perhaps the favored cause and became the favored cause. And one of the questions I really want to answer is why that was the case. But let's look at the detailed story then to understand it more, and some of the committees that were set up, and some of the couriers who traveled back and forth to the Middle East to bring material and ideas back and forth. So one of the very first ones in Denmark to do this sort of work was Gottfried Appel, who was a communist thinker in the group called Kommunistisk Ungdomsforbund, the Communist Youth League, founded in '68. They had a youth wing called KAK, which was responsible for publishing a journal called Ungkommunisten, and it became the main outlet of this kind of Marxist-Leninist view on Palestine from the beginning. He had developed his own version of Marxist notion of false consciousness. He believed that the Western working class was exploited and squeezed for productivity, but these workers were not aware of their situation because rising standards of living and consumerism had made them lazy and complacent. So you couldn't use the working class in Europe for anything. And the Western state he described as a parasitical in the way that it extracted wealth from the duped working class, while implicating it in continued imperialist and neocolonial exploitation. You probably know these kind of ideas. So that means that the real revolution would happen elsewhere, and in fact was happening elsewhere. And the job for real leftists was to connect to this revolution. And then he discovered the PFLP, who were also Marxist-Leninists, and he shared a lot of ideas with them. He tried to convince them of the parasite state theory. They didn't quite buy it, but they found him interesting to talk to and invited him to Beirut. And so they converged. And so Kommunistisk Orientering published an analysis already shortly after '67 that resembled PFLP's political line, emphasized the contradictions of the Arab bourgeoisie, of the bourgeois states and oil-rich countries on the one hand, and Arab workers and peasants on the other hand. The idea was you could mobilize all of this. You could mobilize these masses into a people's war that would become a global war as well. I mean, they were quite ambitious. It was not small fry, these ideas. So in '69, Appel and KAK became fully committed to a partnership with the PFLP, and they began reading Al-Hadaf, the organization's weekly magazine. Unlike the Danish Palestine Committee, which, as I'll show you, was established through contacts and collaboration with members of the Kanafani family and other Palestinians living in Denmark, KAK discovered Palestine through their own political theory and strategy. So that's how they're quite different. Here's a picture of well, this is the 7th volume of Palestine, the journal of the Danish Palestine Committee. And I'll be showing you some of these journals because that's what they were producing, and that's really important material. In Norway and Sweden, there were similar groups of young activists who tuned into the Palestinian cause in the late '60s. None were quite as militant as KAK, CAC later turned the ideological commitment into secret collaboration aimed at procuring funds and weapons for the PFLP. In Norway and Sweden, the first Palestine activists were mainly young students. Some came from working class background, at least in Norway, and many of them were inspired by Maoist ideas. There was a strong Maoist strain, especially in Norway, but also in Sweden, and they had participated in Vietnam protests. In Sweden, one of the pioneers of the Palestine groups in Stockholm was the writer Jan Guillou, and he described his core of group of people, at least, as quite upper middle class. In Norway, most of the early conscripts to the Palestine Committee were students with a Maoist orientation. However, there were a few Palestinians in these circles who facilitated the connection to the PLO and Fatah and the PFLP and the DFLP. In Norway, there was a young Palestinian named Elias Shamas who moved from Lebanon in the mid-60s and befriended a group of student activists in the Socialist Youth Union, SUF, including two of the founders of the Palestine Committee and editors of what became the journal Fritt Palæstina. So this is Palestine, published in the early 70s. This is Fritt Palæstina, still published. It says 2022. That's just my old slides. It's still going. And Palestine's Front, the Palestine groups in Stockholm and later Sweden's journal. So you have these groups and circles, and then you have in Denmark a very interesting relationship with the Kanafani family. So many of you know the work of Ghassan Kanafani, his literary work. What not many people know is that his cousin Nabil Kanafani moved to Denmark via Kuwait and Sweden in 1966. And he started working at the School of Architecture and encountered a group of people who had become interested in Palestine and who would later found the Danish Palestine Committee. He was not actually in very close contact with Ghassan Kanafani, so it's not as if he was sent there by Ghassan Kanafani, one of the founders of the PFLP. But he did establish a contact after he moved to Denmark, and he met. He made sure that Ghassan, when he visited Denmark, met the family of Annie Kanafani, the Danish wife of Ghassan Kanafani. His brothers were communists. So there was this sort of entanglement of parts of the Danish left and youth groups and these Palestinians. Small groups of people, but the ideas became very influential. So like other young Palestinian men, Nabil Kanafani was active in a cultural association in Copenhagen called the Arab Club, Nadi Arabi, a social venue for the small group of Arab immigrants living in Copenhagen. And Ghassan Kanafani would visit from Beirut and speak at the club. And this developed links to the PFLP. This is something that has not been described in the work on the Blekinge Bande, the small group. But there was a wider connection to the PFLP that went into this kind of more general solidarity work. So that meant that connection to Kanafani meant that the ideas of the PFLP, the works of Ghassan Kanafani, made a great impact in Denmark. Kanafani was well known as a journalist and novelist, but also as a member of the PFLP's leadership. He actually oversaw a great deal of the connection to groups and cells abroad. At his office in Beirut, he would receive foreigners. I'll return to some of this in a second. I want to show you here. His office is quite colorful with the posters of all kinds of revolutionary heroes. This is where he would receive journalists and scholars and people who visited, who wanted to know about Palestine and who were led to him. So there were certain people who led visitors to Kanafani, if that was possible. And it's these kind of interlocutors and what I call couriers that I've become very interested in. There was a small group of people who traveled back and forth. And in traveling back and forth, they took posters, they took books from the PLO Research Center, and they took, of course, their inspiration from conversations with Palestinians. They would take posters like these that were produced for the 5th anniversary of the PLO, and they were put up around Christiania in Copenhagen and immediately taken down by right-wing groups. And the police also got on it and so on. They weren't tolerated. They would just hung there for a day or two. And the woman who received them and put them up is still alive, and she has this whole collection of the posters that she shared with me. So people like Birgit Rabeck, who's a Danish journalist and still active Palestine activist. She was a student in Beirut in the early 70s, and she became very close with these groups of people. Attended lectures at the American University in Beirut with the famous Palestinian professors, and encountered Palestinian refugees and intellectuals, but most importantly, brought things back and forth. So people like that, their engagement in the early 70s was almost near total. It's quite incredible to talk to them about things like, how did they get money to just go there and just be there, and what about their life in general? How could they just not do anything but this? But it was a real commitment, an absolute commitment. Solidarity meant for them to get as close as possible to the Palestinian experience, the experience of subjugation and colonial expulsion, to really understand and to be able to communicate what people wished and hoped for. So they had these journeys back and forth to Beirut, and making a journey like that was in a way a ritual, a journey that one had to make to really get close. And if you could visit the Palestinian camps, that was sort of the perfect thing to do, to be initiated, if you want, into the real struggle, and perhaps meet Ghassan Kanafani. So there were these people who were couriers and very important. And I want to say, part of the reason why I wanted to do this research is to show that this quite famous book in Danish about the Blekinge Bande, the Apple group, who became known as terrorists because they robbed bank and killed the policeman and produced funds for the PFLP. This has been known as the story of Palestine solidarity in Denmark, and perhaps to some extent in the Nordic countries, because it was so infamous and well known, and partly because of the TV series that was made in Denmark, and this was an absolute bestseller. We're talking about a group of perhaps 10 people in the Blekinge Bande, and of course it was important and interesting and quite terrible in many ways what they did. Killing a policeman is not something that anyone should celebrate. But there's a much wider phenomenon out there of Palestine solidarity, and I really wanted us to understand that. One side of that for me are the couriers, those who are really closely connected. The other side that I just want to talk a little bit about are those I call the day trippers of the revolution. There were also those who came to Beirut as this kind of a revolutionary hub, just for a short period of time. Journalists, some politicians as well, and drawing people close to the Palestinian revolution in this way created a deep understanding of what was going on. And it was only on the basis of that they were able to do their journals, that it was possible to publish these long analyses that you get in the journals. When we talk about these journals, we have to remember they're fairly small circulation publications, right? There's a danger of blowing this out of proportions, but this is what created the foundation of the Palestinian cause, and so for me that's really important material to look at. In Beirut, you also had people who thought they would come for a very short period of time. This is one of my former colleagues and professors, Jørgen S. Nielsen. He came as a student. He had been at SOAS in London, and then thought he would spend a couple of weeks in Beirut, and he ended up spending 8 years, from 70 to 78. And he was actually employed by the PLO Research Center to work in making this publication, International Documents on Palestine, which became a real sort of go-to resource. And he talks about this milieu of internationals in the early 70s as kind of ecumenical. It's an ecumenical milieu for him, with people from all backgrounds and sympathies in terms of the Palestinian political spectrum. So sometimes we think of it as very sort of geared towards the PFLP or Marxist-Leninism. That's not how he describes it. That's not how a lot of people describe it. As long as you were committed to the Palestinian cause in general, you were welcome and you were given a place to work and be. So there's the Institute for Palestine Studies that was set up, and there's the PLO Research Center as two sort of intellectual hubs And many Europeans began to live around these hubs. Some of them began to date and sometimes even marry Palestinians. According to Jan Nielsen's estimate, 10 to 20% of the staff at the two centers were actually foreigners, and some were intermarried with Palestinian intelligentsia. A famous one would be Rosemary Sayek, who was married to Yusuf Sayek. And in an interview, she talks about how she moved to Beirut already in 1953 and became deeply engaged with the Palestinian Lebanese society. And so as early as 63, her and Walid Khalidi, one of the founders of the Institute for Palestine Studies, would invite journalists and political figures on tours in the Palestinian camps. They realized that there was a need for this kind of interlocutor role. After the 67 war, she really wanted to counter the negative media coverage of the Palestinian freedom fighters in a more systematic way. And so she founded what she called the 5th of June Society. So that was a network of trusted people who would introduce outsiders to the right people, to Fatah spokesman Mohammed Tijani and Ghassan Kanafani. So it wasn't just PFLP or Fatah, it would be very broad. Annie Kanafani played the same kind of role, and she also worked in this society, especially taking British and Scandinavian journalists to the PFLP office. I think this kind of introduction made some journalists and even some politicians sympathetic, at least listening to the Palestinian side of the story. So there was a wider translation also of the Palestinian perspective into our publics in Europe and Scandinavian. So the personal connections and the relatively significant amount of solidarity activists who stayed in Beirut, as opposed to the day trippers of revolution who came and went, created an important trust in the ability of having a connection, intermediaries of internationalization of the cause. Their job, whether in Beirut or in the whole countries, was crucial for the translation to an international public of the Palestinian experience. So let me just return briefly to our Norwegian friends here, Lysestøl and Schue. They were not day trippers for sure, even if they lived in Norway, because if you look at their travel itinerary from 68 to 71, it's quite impressive given the cost of air travel at that time and the fact that both were university students. After the first two visits to Cairo and the Gaza Strip, both of them spent time with Fatah militants in Jordan in the summer of 1970, during which they went on missions with Fatah fighters to the West Bank. They describe these trips vividly in Lysestøl's book, Palestinerne, from 73, which is the first detailed account of Palestinian organizations in Norwegian. I think it's quite an important book. On a quick trip then back to Scandinavia, this would be in September, they held meetings, September 70, right? They held meetings in Gothenburg with PLO officials about setting up Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish Palestine committees. Soon after that, a couple of weeks, they were back in Amman, just in time for Black September, 1970, where they were because they were part of a joint Scandinavian delegation at the second Congress for Palestine, which Pelle and I have written about with our colleague Sorcha Thompson in a journal article recently. So then they went back to Norway, and 2 months after they went to Beirut because the Palestinians were kicked out and had moved to Lebanon. So they moved with them, and they still wanted to talk and continue the conversation. So it was a complete engagement and quite incredible to discover. And I asked them, like, how did you have time? And they said, well, we just didn't think about it. We were young. This was a youth project. I mean, in many ways, the 70s was one long youth project of the people who became, of the 68 generation, who became so politicized and engaged. And it worked really well because in the 70s, most of them still didn't have families. So they could make that a kind of engagement. Then the 70s ended, and it was just a new time with Reagan and Thatcher and neoliberalism and Deng Xiaoping and the fading of many of the dreams and consumerism and what have you. And, so I think we have to see it in that kind of framework. Anyway, back to the magazines. They really where you have all that accumulated knowledge of having been there, having talked to people, having learned yourself. They're stuffed into these magazines, and these magazines start to educate a public, start to educate networks about the broader context in which the Palestinian struggle should be seen, about what it means, about the historical details, and following also then the development of the Palestinian struggle. When you read these magazines, these journals throughout the years, it's also sort of an inventory of how the Palestinian cause becomes involved in the Lebanese civil war in the mid-70s, how some of the solidarity work becomes more sort of medical aid work in Norway, the emergence of Norvac as a framework for helping civilians, and with that, a kind of emergence of humanitarianism, more than revolution, as a framework for the solidarity work. And Pelle has also written interesting stuff about that. I think I've talked a long time already, and I'm going to skip a little bit here, because I want to end with my proper last chapter, which is a conclusion of the story at a place that I love in Beirut called Café Rauda. It's on the Corniche, and we will end there in a minute. There's a lot more for me to say about the interpretation and representation of the Palestinian cause in our Nordic countries. It's changed a lot over the years as a result of Palestinian tactics changing as much as internal debates on the left in our own countries. And their relationship with the wider public and the authorities also changed. Security services began really listening into their activities, not least during the height of the international war between Mossad and Black September. And you know about the killings and kidnappings, including the killing in Norway of the wrong person, as it turned out. And this was a real war, and that really securitized the whole work immensely. And you can just ask Jan Guillou about that, because he was involved. He was one of the founders of the Palestine groups in Stockholm. As a young student, Guillou befriended Staffan Beckman, another of the founders. And Beckman quite early on wrote an influential leftist introduction to Palestine, became a driving force for solidarity in Sweden and actually also Scandinavia. People in Denmark read Staffan Beckman's book widely. Beckman's wife had been posted to Beirut as a journalist back in '65, and that's where Beckman learned about Palestinian liberation struggle. And he was also strongly influenced by Maoism and remained that for quite a while. Through Marxist-Leninism, he got in contact with the Apple Group in Copenhagen. And in '68, he already regarded Apple as an important theorist of the revolutionary class struggle. Another important figure in the Swedish story here is Daoud Kalotti. He had he's a Palestinian who had come to know Beckman at a demonstration in June '67. Which, according to Kalotti's own account in his autobiography, started as a pro-Israel demonstration against the Arab Hitler, against Nasser. So here were Swedish leftists demonstrating against the Arab Hitler. But Daoud Kalotti went up and talked to these leftists. We presume it was a quite small crowd. And almost magically, he convinced them in a matter of hours that Israel was the real culprit in the war. And so the whole demonstration changed their slogan to support Palestine. Luckily, Kalotti lived very close to the place where the demonstration was taking place, and he had Palestinian flags at home. So he hurried back and gave them Palestinian flags. And that's how the first pro-Palestinian demonstration developed. I'm not sure this story is completely true, to be honest, but that's how he tells it. He died just a couple of months ago, by the way. And he did, in fact, become part of a group of 6 people who wrote and distributed the first issues of Palestine's Front. And Beckman and Guillou were also part of that. Guillou had a less strongly ideological approach than Beckman from the beginning, and he left the group after a few years. Palestine's Front continued to be published by the Palestine groups in Stockholm and later by the Palestine groups in Sweden. It resembled Palestine and Fit Palestina in layout and content. And each issue had the same cover of marching Fedayeen and so on. So there are really these strong similarities between the three Scandinavian movements and their journals. And I think that I've shown that that can be explained by close contacts between some of their members and parallel adventures in Beirut. So Jan Guillou has dramatized his youth adventures in Beirut in recent novels, in 2 recent novels, and you see them up here. In the books, there's a protagonist called Eric Letang. That's really his alter ego as a young man. During the 1960s and 70s, he was a law student from an upper middle class background in Stockholm. And in the books, he becomes involved with pro-Palestine youth activists and travels to Copenhagen, where comrades link him to a German group, roughly based on the Baader Meinhof group. And he gets sent to on a mission to meet Ghassan Kanafani and George Habash, the PFLP leader, in Beirut. It's with all his novels, it's a real thriller. You know, you get the sense. In real life, Guillou did indeed work with Danish leftists and participated in a reportage journey to the Palestinian camps in Jordan as a photographer for Politisk Revue in '69. The fictional Guillou, Eric, arrives in Beirut to discuss the position of the Palestine groups with Kanafani. The novel's portrayal of contacts is slightly dramatized compared to accounts that I got from interviews. But it still gives us a good sense of the interaction and political stakes between Palestinian leaders and the early solidarity activists. Having introduced himself with a letter from his Palestinian friend in Sweden, which might be Daoud Kalotti, Eric is instructed to wait at his Beirut hotel until further notice. And he gets really nervous sitting there waiting. He thinks maybe I'm going to be kidnapped or something. And he thinks back in the novel to his time as an exchange student in Montpellier, just a few years before that, when he used to be much less political and carefree, much more liberal, I suppose. And he thinks, what happened between Montpellier and Beirut was the Vietnam War, quite simply. It presented him, Eric, with a number of clear moral choices that made a chain of logical events until the present moment. In other words, a moral character would have to react to imperialism. I think this is so telling for the logic, for the way of thinking back then. If you were moral, you just had to react. You had to end up with a commitment, and you had to sit in that hotel waiting for Ghassan Kanafani. Like, there was no other way, even if you were slightly alienated and apprehensive about the whole situation. Then Kanafani arrives with some bodyguards and picks him up, and they go to the seaside restaurant, Rauda Cafe. And there they sit and discuss the solidarity scene, and Kanafani kind of interviews him about how he sees everything. And he asks him about the difference between Danish and Swedish groups. And Eric describes a split between PFLP-oriented groups and another group with no affiliation, which is probably the split between Guillou and Beckman himself. In Denmark, Eric tells Kanafani there's a group of more secretive Marxist-Leninist activists. This is the Apple group, and so on. So he's told the Palestinian leader all this, and then he wonders to himself, he had just implicitly encouraged the PFLP to enlist the Danes for military training, or what's going on. As they finish their lunch, 4 armed men suddenly arrived at their table, followed by a man in khaki suit and sunglasses. This is PFLP's founder and political leader, George Habash. Eric has already met him in Amman 2 years earlier. Habash sits down and he asks him right away, to what extent is the Swedish security service following the Swedish Palestine groups? Eric replies that they follow him a lot. In fact, they attempted to infiltrate them by planting a mole in their circles, who after a while urged them to attack a synagogue. And people who were in this group have told me this story. There was indeed a mole. Someone was planted by the security service, but they didn't try to make them attack the synagogue. This is, again, a dramatization. But the idea is that they wanted to criminalize and brand them as terrorist and anti-Semitic. As long as we can keep weapons away from our work in Sweden, Eric explains to Habash and Kanafani, we will be able to continue our solidarity work. As long as it's not militarized, we'll be fine. We will protect our realm. I think it's quite interesting and maybe sort of prophetic, this. He tries to convince the 2 leaders that Swedish Palestine solidarity needs to be kept clear of the militant path, or else they will end up in prison or be ostracized by society. In the end, Habash appears to accept this plea and promises Erik that the PFLP will not try to recruit any Fedayeen from Sweden. I think these exact meetings did not really take place, and that's not really the point. But I wanted to end my talk with Guillaume's novel because memories are not histories. And we as historians are faced with the challenge of working out the slippages between narratives of the past and knowledges of the past. Luckily, we have all the written archives of the movements and their members, and they show that there were actually really extensive contacts between solidarity activists and the PFLP leadership, and the Fatah leadership, in the case of Norway in particular. Whereas the Apple Group engaged in shadowy security partnerships, my research has found no evidence that the regular solidarity activists did more than Guillaume's alter ego. So they worked, they tried to understand, they couriered material back and forth. This gave them a corpus of informative and often dogmatic text and images that established a template for Scandinavian Palestine solidarity. And I think that template is so important for understanding why solidarity work is blooming today in the way that it is, but we can discuss that as well. Certainly, if you look at the later solidarity activists and their magazines, they built on the early work. They also, of course, departed from it. I mean, there were moments like the Munich massacre and the assassination of Hassan Kanafani in Beirut and so on that brought up the question of violence and split some people over that. A lot of things have happened in the story of Palestine, but I think the fundamental question of the way Palestine struggles to survive as a people, a nation, as the creation of a state, and the necessity of international support for that project, that remains. And the way that was theorized and articulated was really the platform for that. So that would be all for this story. These are pictures of a demonstration in Copenhagen in the 1970s and the material that they produced themselves. Very typical of the 70s. Today we have very different demonstrations, the largest demonstrations in Denmark's history that we've seen the last 6 months, and I'm sure it's the same here. We're witnessing something really tremendously historical, I think, and because it's historical, we need the historical background also. Thank you for listening.
So we now have some time for questions, and I actually have a couple, but because we don't have that much time yet, I wanted to start by asking the audience if there are any questions for Sune.
Yes, thank you very much. Interesting stories. Wondering about what you said at the end, the importance, the influence of these organizations on today's activities, and if you have compared them with other countries where there were no movements or weaker movements, do you see the difference? Thanks.
You know, it's hard to say really, but I participate in some of the demonstrations and I talk to some of the organizers and so on. I don't think that they go back to the text from the early 70s. I think what's more the case is that it's created a tradition and a sort of organizational tradition, but also a tradition of understanding where people build on ways of doing demonstrations, of chanting and so on, that can be rediscovered. What I do see is a certain interest in the history with some of these people. They're curious about it. Some of them have family histories of activists as well that go back. I think there is something to what you're saying. I mean, this idea that some countries like Norway, where there's a stronger tradition, you see a stronger commitment to pro-Palestinian demonstrations and organization. And that's certainly the case in both Ireland and Norway, and where it also kind of translates into a political platform. So the push from civil society has also created a push on politicians to represent Palestine in a different way, where I think those two countries and possibly also Spain represent a kind of left wing in the European on the European scene. I think in some countries with a much weaker tradition, what's at stake is to what extent talking about the need for Palestinian liberation or the reality of Israeli occupation has been normalized, right, in political discourse. I think part of that normalization has happened in Norway because of the work of the Palestine Committee. That's my impression, but I'm not. I can't say I know more than Norway about Norway than you living here do. But I think that's how it works. It's this sort of normalization of certain ideas and the challenging of Zionist frameworks. And in some countries, that's been much more difficult and much less successful. And it's not to say that in Germany there has been no Palestine, pro-Palestine mobilization or history of that. But of course, they've come up against a whole different sort of discursive historical framework, which we see today.
Yes, there's a speaker. 1 second.
I lived in Copenhagen in this period and was in contact with kind of any groups, and what it became the Palestine Committee in Copenhagen. But I see the Blikkingegadebanden and Kok Godfred Appel. There was a blind road. Have you looked into the contact with the unions movement and how it affected the union and the solidarity work? In Norway, it has been an important issue to take contact and involve the unions.
Absolutely, and I have looked into that in the case of Norway, where that's the most prevalent in Scandinavia. And I think the kind of institutional connections the union created also to workers' unions, both in Israel, actually, and in Palestinian circles. So you have the PWU, the Palestinian Workers' Union, and that connection became very important because it overlapped with some of the other activist networks that I was describing, the Arab Club, the immigrant milieus, and so on in Copenhagen. But it wasn't taken to the, let's say, the higher level of the organized labor unions in Denmark, like it was in Norway. And again, that elevation of the work into more organized politics and even into Arbeiderpartiet to some extent is the reason, I think, why the Oslo process happened in Norway and not in Denmark. Although some Danish politicians claimed that they were offered the chance to sort of host the Oslo agreements in Copenhagen, and said this is Uffe Ellemann who claims that it might as well have happened in Denmark. I don't think that's the case. I think the reason why it happened in Norway is this kind of institutional high-level normalization of the legality of the Palestinian struggle and the need to support it.
We have a question from Knut. Knut, there's a speaker coming to you in a second.
Well, it's not so much a question as a comment. Since we also have a few here.
Yeah.
And I think we have to start with always to have some kind of autobiography to place yourself. So I came to Oslo in 1970, and I was a left-winger, a kind of anarcho-Maoist at the time. But I wasn't involved in Palestine. I was only marginal in the Palestine group, but and only from the mid-70s, 76 thereabouts. And not very much, because I was I really started with it when I was in London to study Arabic, so I only had marginal contacts in Oslo. But I kind of, from what you said, what you are talking about, I think is very interesting. Your focus on this Arabs and the Kurds, as you call it. But from my memory of this, it's a kind of, from the Norwegian perspective only, there's a kind of the 2-3 aspects of a basis for the Palestine support movement, which you could think of. One is based really on Vietnam. Vietnam is the key thing here. And I remember myself that in 1967, I was also a member of SUF and kind of Maoist, but also very supportive of Israel. And that switched. And at that point in the late 60s, there was a split in the Vietnam movement. On the one hand, there were people from the Labour Party, Communist Party, and so on, who were working for peace in Vietnam. And then there was a more leftist movement which says, no, peace isn't enough. We must work for solidarity, meaning victory for the liberation movement, victory for NFL. So they formed the Solidarity Committee for Vietnam. And for them, the key thing was to look at Vietnam as an expression of worldwide US imperialism. And then everything follows from that. From about 1970, you had support groups for everything. You had support groups for Palestine, as Chile came in 1973, for Greece, for Africa, and so on. And so for that category of people, support for Palestine came as a result of the global expression of US imperialism. So that was one kind of one category. And for that category, which you of course know because you have written about it, but it's important to see here also, means that kind of left-wing connection, which made this part of a broader thing. Otherwise, Palestine was very much sensitive, the most sensitive of all these regional things, because that really people hated, anti-Israeli stuff. But the danger of that was that it got linked to the agenda of the far left, meaning in Norway, the Marxist-Leninist, the ML movement. And the ML movement became more and more, as you had in one of your early posters there, fight against US and Soviet imperialism. Yep. PLO didn't want to fight against Soviet imperialism because they got the support from the Soviet Union. So that created a problem. It created a split in the Norwegian movement. So the people who were not part of the Marxist-Leninist movement, they moved away to form the Palestine Front, which was a very parallel type of front. They looked exactly the same, except for the fact that they didn't have the Soviet stuff. And they also had the same kind of people who were totally committed, as you said. Kjell Bygstad is mentioned, and when you mentioned the trade unions, that was kind of their thing. They were the ones who started building the connections between the Palestinian and the Norwegian workers' movement, which was really a big thing, because the Norwegian labor or the international committee was totally pro-Israeli, totally the identification with Israel. And that's changed because of the activities of these people in the late 70s, around before 1980 and so. So that was one kind of thing. But I think another thing, since we are here now in a university, it's also interesting to look at, and that was triggered by your picture of Jørgen Nielsen, which I never knew. He was in Palestine that long, and that was an academic. Those academics who were from, you said, late 70s. I think we can talk about in Oslo from about 76, 78. Thereabouts, and Gunnar Meidel became associate professor of Arabic, and you started getting more left-wing, younger, anti-imperialist people into academic positions.
Bjørn Olav Utvik is...
He was much later. That was in the 90s.
But he was already tuned into this at that point.
He was a student in 82, 83, something.
But with a Maoist perspective.
But with the Maoist, yes, he was an activist in Red Youth. But the key thing, Gunvor was active mainly in the Palestine front, but not very much. But the key person here in Norway is Nils Butenschøn, who was a political scientist, and who had been a member of the Palestine Committee, but broke with them with the split with the Maoists, and then became kind of a key figure in the Palestine Front, and was also a key figure in the intellectual movements on Middle East. And wrote books about anti-Zionism, the Drømmen for Sionism, and so on.
That's a fascinating story of how this engagement translates into more sort of organized academic work on the Middle East.
So
I mean, when it comes to, it's a very interesting train of thought, because when it comes to the US, some of the first Palestine activism was entwined with the foundation of MISA and the Merritt Report, and the foundations of modern Middle East studies.
Yes,
had a Saidian but also pro-Palestinian kind of platform.
So but that wasn't really apart from Utvik, who kind of had moved away from active Maoists. Of course, the Maoist movement basically collapsed by about 1978. It wasn't too many people. People were moved away from the party.
They started to find out what happened in the Cultural Revolution.
Yes,
and wasn't so pretty.
So from Utvik's, I think he became he was interested mainly mainly interested from the academic side rather from the political side. But the key thing, which of course this has become more and more Norwegian now, but the Lebanon, the Norwegian activity in South Lebanon, the UN UNIFIL was key in developing Palestine support, because they actually met Israelis.
I mean, you're adding some very interesting and important details that unfortunately I didn't have time for, but
no, but I think this of course I know you've written about it, but I think it's kind of.
But it's going to be part of the story, and
but
some of the things that happened towards the end of the 70s are important for understanding why the Palestinian cause also changed after 82.
I'm going to jump in here and use my powers as a moderator to make sure that we also have time for questions from the online audience. Are there any questions from the online audience? If not, then we'll go to Anne. You had a question. Thank you.
Yeah, I have, I think, a kind of follow-up from what the discussion you just had now with Knut, because coming into this later on, I mean, at a later stage, I think my sort of vision of the Palestine solidarity movement is basically more humanitarian oriented, just like you said, right? That it went from revolution to a kind of assistance, medical and otherwise. And I just was interested to hear your opinion, if you see in this shift a kind of resignation, which is now being kind of maybe retargeted towards liberation and vocabulary like this, or if I'm or not, basically.
Okay, yeah, great question. I think traditionally that's been the way that scholars and observers in general have viewed it, that it was part of the reason why Arafat succeeded in creating a Palestinian state, and part of the reason why that Palestinian state was a quasi-state that didn't go anywhere and was defeated. So it relates to the question of whether you think that the Palestinians took the right path in their project, or whether you sort of reject that. And the rejectionist front always maintained that there has to be the possibility of an armed response as well, and maintain some of the old revolutionary rhetoric and the anti-imperialist framework and so on. And it felt as if the humanitarian framework didn't have space for that. And in that lay a sort of capitulation. And increasingly, as we saw the Palestinian Authority being dominated and the expansion of settlements in the 90s and so on, I think that way of thinking about the Palestinian story became more and more prevalent. And you don't have to be a Hamas supporter to take that, but you could just observe that hasn't brought Palestinians independence and sovereignty. Then I think the question becomes, how do you break with that? And in order to break with that, you might have to also break with the rhetoric of just feeling sorry for the Palestinian victim, and go back to the idea that they have the power to also dictate. They don't always have to be receivers of donor aid and sort of emasculated victims and so on. Some of that thinking ends in a support for military resistance, and I see that in some of the, at least in some of the Palestinian milieus. It explains some of the support that we see for Hamas now, and it also explains this sort of uneasy relationship between the resistance against occupation and the call for ceasefire and so on, and then those who see that as actual support for Hamas. It's where those accusations come in. So you're touching on something really important. I think Pelle wrote a really interesting contribution to this book that I edited this year about third worldism in the Middle East. That book is really about that period where the old revolutionary narrative stops to make sense, and there's a new a shift to different new narratives. One of them is humanitarian.
And I think it's interesting.
And you have a good argument in that,
Yeah.
that goes a little bit against what I'm saying.
I'll just very briefly add that, like, I think it's interesting to note that, especially in the Norwegian case, where sort of medical aid was always a big part of the solidarity movement, it was not seen or practiced separately from the political and revolutionary work for a very long time, right? That only happens later. So it was seen as part and parcel of the work of the solidarity committees. In fact, the solidarity committees were the ones doing the medical work, right?
We're talking about Norvak here.
Yeah, and it's only later. And actually, I think in the beginning, the decision to make a humanitarian sort of non-political organization is a more pragmatic one, because it becomes very difficult for for people working with the Palestinians to get access to Lebanon. So if you work with the Palestinians, if you're pro-Palestinian, you can't really get access. So it's a sort of more pragmatic one to begin with, to say we're a non-political humanitarian organization, and
So I think where you really start to see the critique of that is in the 90s, where the NGOization of politics becomes clear, and this kind of humanitarian aid politics is criticized. And the response to that at the international level is the rise of the International Solidarity Movement, ISM, right? And I think that's where you need, if you want to write a modern history of all this, I'm focusing on the 60s and 70s, but the modern history that leads up to what happens today is much more important for what happens today, I think, is the reformulation of Palestinian resistance at a global level in the ISM. Rachel Corrie run over by the bulldozer, the people who tried to get in on the West Bank do work there, work with Al-Haq, work with the humanitarian organizations, but also those who report on the violence and so on. And the framework of rights and the framework of BDS then comes after ISM. I think that really makes much more sense if we are to understand what's going on today. But of course, they were standing on the shoulders of what I'm describing. Yeah. Then we start to see the whole timeline, right?
So I'm gonna have to end this exciting conversation now, because we're actually out of time. We can continue the discussion afterwards outside, but we'll have to end here. So thank you so much for joining us today, Sune, and thanks for everyone who came.